So I'd now like to use Dr. Michael Wagner. Mike is the author of a book on the English chartered trading companies, and his talk this evening is going to be drawing on that. Brief background, he got his DPhil from the University of Oxford, and he now teaches courses in 18th century British history in the Department of Continuing Education at Oxford. Mike, if you wish to expand, please do so. But I'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've stopped.
Can I share screen now?
Yes, you should be able to do that.
Okay. And I'll go to the big screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
Good.
Yes, thank you, Quentin. I'll apologize in advance. I'm shaking the end of a cold, so if I cough occasionally, please forgive me. The only thing that Quentin forgot in his introduction is my accent's Canadian, but I have lived in England since 1995. I suppose when most people think about chartered companies, they think about the East India Company. And there's very good reasons for that. Its size, its importance as a military force, its economic importance, the connections many people, certainly in this country, have with British India. But the East India Company wasn't the only chartered trading company that was active in the period I'm looking at, 1688 to 1763. So my study looks at five companies: the East India Company, the Royal African Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Russia Company, and you'll be happy to know the Levant Company. I think looking at the companies together is useful not only in that it allows you to look at similarities and differences between the companies, but it also gives you a sense of their collective contribution to British economic development. The period of the study, 1688 to 1763. Now that was chosen because in 1688, England, this is the year of the Glorious Revolution, England was a relatively minor country on the western fringe of Europe. The population of England and Wales combined was about a quarter that of France, and the Dutch Republic was still considerably ahead of England as a commercial nation and also as the financial center of Europe. By 1763, this is totally transformed. Britain is the leading nation in Europe, the strongest military power, the strongest commercial power. London is becoming the financial capital of Europe, and the French are basically reduced to just the rump of an empire, and the British Empire is very large and expanding. So the dimensions I wanted to look at in my study are three, and the first I've called guns. Now, guns refers to rivalry. And although the chartered companies ostensibly had monopolies in their chartered trading areas, they did face competition. And the most, or rivalry, I should say more accurately, the most important form of rivalry was rivalry with other European countries overseas. But periodically, they also faced challenges from merchants within Britain. How did they respond to these competitive threats? Well, you got to remember, this is a period before the Industrial Revolution. Britain did not have an unassailable advantage in terms of the quality and price of trade goods. I maintain that the key way in which British companies responded was through financial innovation, hence money. And then finally, lawyers, as these were chartered companies, their charters were periodically subject to review in Parliament. And the best way the companies could defend against those challenges was to demonstrate their financial viability. So I will start with a few slides talking about the environment within which the companies operated, and then I'll talk about each of the companies in turn. One of the important things to note about this period was it was a period of very significant warfare. The Glorious Revolution, 1688, triggered a series of 6 major wars involving Britain and France, the respective allies. In total, between 1688 and Waterloo, Britain and France were at war for more than half the period. And in my study, there's 4 major wars worthy of mention. 9 Years' War, War of the Spanish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession. These are traditional sorts of wars. They're about dynastic succession, which royal family has the most legitimate claim to which piece of territory. War of Jenkins Ear started as a war in the West Indies between Britain and Spain, and then into the Austrian Succession. So these are sort of traditional sorts of wars. The 7 Years' War is different. 7 Years' War has been called the First World War. It's about geopolitical spheres of influence. It's about economics. It's about control of trade routes. And it was a very, very significant British victory. It basically took France out of North America, and to a large extent out of a lot of the West Indies. There were other significant wars that had implications for the chartered companies. The wars of the Holy League, or the Great Turkish War, as they are sometimes known, saw the Ottomans defeated at the gates of Vienna in 1683, and the Ottomans lost basically most of Hungary and parts of modern Romania. The Great Northern War was very important. The Great Northern War was between Russia and Sweden. Russia emerged victorious and basically captured the Swedish territory in the East Baltic, and this gave Russia access to the Baltic and permitted the establishment of the Russian capital at St. Petersburg. There were other wars involving the Ottomans in the 1730s, wars with Persia, where the Persians recaptured territory in Crimea, in the Caucasus and elsewhere. Persia was also on a bit of an offensive during this period. Notably, there was a sack of Delhi in 1739, the war with the Mughals. And wars with Russia. The Russians were moving south and threatening Crimea. They didn't take Crimea in this period, but they did capture the fortress of Azov. Capture of Crimea happened later on in the late 1760s. Then finally, we have the Carnatic Wars in India. And the period we're looking at, this involved 3 wars. The first 2 were strictly in southern India. The third involved Bengal, and it's in Bengal where the famous Battle of Plassey took place, where basically the French were taken out as a serious military threat to the British in India. So warfare and recurrent warfare is a key overarching influence on what's going on in British history in this period. Now, looking at the commercial side of things. Now, Britain, and we see here in the period 1760, 1720, the exports of England were far greater than the exports of France. By the middle of the century, essentially, the French had caught up. And so this indicates that although on a per capita basis, overseas trade was still more important for the English, the commercial momentum was with France. And even in those brief periods when France and England weren't fighting, there was still an ongoing commercial rivalry. Another important point to note about this period, again, I said this is before the Industrial Revolution. Far and away, the most important British export is woolen cloth. This is taken from a book by Joshua G., written in 1729, The Trade and Navigation of Great Britain Considered, where he looks at what Britain traded on a bilateral basis with various European countries. So woolen cloth, far and away, the most important export. And just say as an aside, in the late 17th century, the Levant Company was by far and away the most important exporter of woolen cloth of all the chartered companies. A lot of that had to do with climate. This was not an era of free trade, far from it. In fact, if anything, it was an era of increasing protection. So before 1688, the general level of tariffs on imports and exports, there were actually duties on exports at the time, was 5%. And this progressively increased. So by 1759, the general duty on imports was 25%. And many other countries in Western and Northern Europe had imposed similar sorts of tariffs. So trading with traditional trading partners in Europe became more and more difficult through war, through the imposition of increasing duties. I think this cartoon is interesting. This is by James Gilray. It's entitled The Plum Pudding in Danger. It dates from 1805, when a peace treaty between Britain and France was being considered. And on the left, you have Pitt the Younger. And Pitt the Younger is carving off a piece of the plum pudding called Oceans. On the right, of course, is Napoleon. He's carving off a piece called Europe. And this is, a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it does express the idea that Britain was increasingly being seen as a maritime power. France was increasingly viewed as a continental European power. Now, I think it's useful to have a look at the map of the world in 1700 and look where these 5 chartered companies operated that I'm examining. So the Russia Company obviously is operating in Russia. The Levant Company is operating in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire at this time was not quite the force it had been, but it was still very significant and covered a very large amount of territory, including most of southeastern Europe. The East India Company traded with the Mughal Empire in India, the Qing Empire in China. The Safavid Empire in Persia is interesting. It was, to an extent, it was contested between companies. It was most important for the Levant Company because the source of Levant silk, which was the main main import of the British Levant Company, came from northern Iran on the Caspian Sea. But the East India Company had an important trading port at Bandar Abbas on the Strait of Hormuz. The Russia Company even briefly established a trade into Persia. Now, if we turn our gaze to the left, the Royal African Company, its main job in life was to transport slaves from West Africa to the British colonies in the New World, overwhelmingly to the West Indies. They also dabbled in other African goods. Probably the most important one was gold, but the slave trade was the mainstay of the Royal African Company's operations. And then finally, we have the Hudson's Bay Company. It operated in northern Canada on Hudson's Bay, and its main reason for being was the trade in furs. So you can see, just geographically, even apart from the economic significance of all these trades, the chartered trading companies that were in existence traded to a vast portion of the world's geography. Company charters. What were the chartered companies set up to do? And this is taken from an exchange between Secretary Walsingham and Queen Elizabeth I when the Levant Company was being considered. Although this was written concerning the Levant Company, I think the principles apply to the other companies as well. So basically, the idea for the companies was that they would provide profit to the state without while minimizing the involvement and the expense to the state. To the extent possible, the companies were expected to look after their own defense needs. Now, this turned out not to be possible in many cases. Heavy intervention was required, particularly from the Royal Navy, but the principle was, as much as possible, the chartered companies should stand on their own feet. Significant powers were delegated to the companies. And in fact, after the restoration of Charles II, a few of the companies were actually given the right to wage war against non-Christians. This did not apply to the Levant Company, but it applied to the East India and Royal African companies. The companies were heavily dependent on the Royal Navy. These were all maritime trades. This is the Royal Navy flag, which was in place for most of the 18th century. You might note the similarities with the flag of the East India Company and another very large country in North America. So what did the companies rely on the Navy for? Well, it was convoy support. Some of the trades were very dangerous. And I'm not just, they were vulnerable not just to attacks from foreign navies, mainly the French and the Spanish Navy, but attacks by privateers were a very major concern early on in the 18th century. Privateers, not privates, privateers are people who operate under license from the government with a which gave them the right to attack enemy shipping. Probably the biggest and most famous loss of commercial shipping occurred in 1693, when there was a fleet destined for the Levant, a joint Anglo-Dutch fleet was attacked off Lagos in Portugal, and about 100 ships were lost. It was a national catastrophe. There was a big outcry, and after that, more rigorous form of convoy support was implemented. The ships used by the companies varied greatly in size. This is a reconstructed Dutch East India Company ship. And these were the biggest ships of all. This one is about 1,000 tons. It had a crew of about 300 people, often carried a lot of soldiers as well. The Levant ships were quite heavily armed. Levant ships were maybe about 300 tons, but they had a lot of guns because shipping to Levant was very dangerous. You not only had privateers in the Channel, you had you had the Spanish Navy, you had the main French naval base at Toulon, and then you still had pirates operate from North Africa. So very, very dangerous. Hudson's Bay Company ships were about half the size of the Levant ships. There were two types of companies, two legal forms of companies. The first is what was known as regulated companies, and that applies to the Russia and the Levant companies. Essentially, they were associations of merchants. You can consider them to be an evolution of medieval guilds. So you had to comply with certain laws, certain regulations established by the companies, but merchants were there to make money for their own benefit. There were very few joint expenses. The East India, Hudson's Bay, and Royal African companies were quite different. They were joint stock companies, so they sold stock to the public, and they pooled their investments and owned joint assets. So let me start. Now I'm going to take the companies in order of when they chartered. So the first company to be chartered was the Russia Company. At the time, it was referred to as a Muscovy Company. People started referring to it as the Russia Company really in the beginning of the 18th century during the reign of Peter the Great. So the company was chartered in 1555. There was a lot of interest. There were about 200 financial backers. People knew virtually nothing about Muscovy or Russia. People in Britain, England, knew virtually nothing about Muscovy or Russia at the time. The trade to Russia was seen as a possible means of finding a northeast passage to China, which was the ultimate destination for overseas traders. At the time the company was chartered, shipping had to go via the White Sea route into Archangel. And it was only after the Great Northern War of 1700-1721 that the Russia Company acquired access to the Baltic, St. Petersburg, Narva in Estonia, and Riga. St. Petersburg became the most important Russian port for overseas trade. Riga was the second most important. What was the business of the Russia Company? The most important thing that Britain got from Russia was naval stores. These were things used to build ships. Tar, pitch, timber, iron, hemp. Those are the key ones. And Russia was the main source of naval stores. And as you can see from this chart, there was a major ramp up in Royal Navy shipbuilding in the second half of the century. And in fact, in the second half of the century, Russia became the most important European source of imports into Britain. The main competition for the British Russia Company was the Dutch. The Dutch had dominated Western trade in the 17th century. A lot of that domination was reinforced by the fact that Russian customs duties were paid in Dutch currency, and this gave the Dutch an inherent price advantage, perhaps as much as 10% in trade with the Russians. Bills of exchange concerning Russian trade were mainly settled in Amsterdam. Things started to change in 1734 with the conclusion of an Anglo-Russian commerce treaty, boosted Russian trade, basically shut the French out of Russian trade. The French were much friendlier with the Scandinavian countries, and London became increasingly important as a financial center for that trade. St. Petersburg, this is a street in St. Petersburg called the English Embankment, and this is where the Russia Company had its factory in St. Petersburg. Whoops. Uh-oh. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Are you looking at a slide called British Perceptions of Russians? Okay, this is from Anthony Cross. I think this is interesting how British perceptions of Russians evolved. So in the late 16th century, described as a people passing rude to vices vile inclined, ignorant and godless. Late 17th century, Russians have no learning, nor will suffer it to be among them. 18th century, things are changing. Peter the Great, the most genuine and active prince. Peter the Great visited both Britain and the Dutch Republic. The governor of the Levant Company used to take care of Russian princes at Peter the Great's behest. And then under Catherine the Great, there's growing interest in Russian culture. I think these more favorable perceptions of Russians in the 18th century had a lot to do with the fact that Russia was in very much an expansionary mode, expanding into what had been Poland, Lithuania, expansion to the Baltic, and then expansion into the south towards the Black Sea. Levant Company, the second one of the companies to be chartered, 1581. I think not coincidentally, 10 years after the Battle of Lepanto, where the Ottomans suffered a significant naval defeat. So the three main, I'm not telling anyone on this call anything new here, three main centers of trade, Aleppo, Smyrna, Constantinople. I suppose if you were going to pick a fourth one, it would be Alexandria. And Leghorn or Livorno in Tuscany was a very important entrepot in the trade between the West and the Eastern Mediterranean. Other places like Thessalonica or Salonika, they only became important really sort of towards the end of the 18th century, only became really significant then. So I mentioned the main business of the Levant Company was to import silk from the Ottoman Empire. The original source was Gilan province on the Caspian Sea. The silk would be taken by caravan cross country to centers in Turkey, places like Turkey and Syria, places like Aleppo and Smyrna, and then transported to the West. Gilan was cut off as a source of silk after the wars of the 1730s, and the Levant Company had to seek alternative sources of silk, which came from Anatolia largely. Now, the French were the major competition in the Levant. France was the most important Western trading partner for the Ottomans. Just as there had been a commerce treaty in Russia which favored the British, there was a treaty in 1740 which gave France preferred duties for exports to the Ottoman Empire. This was a round of the capitulations. By 1770, the beginning of the 1770s, French exports were 10 times that of Britain. So the Levant, until the very end of the 18th century, when the cotton trade to Britain took off, it was always just much more important to the French than the British. Part of it might have had to do with the proximity of Marseille, but it was just that the French were interested in a wider range of Ottoman imports than the British were. The French also had very strong diplomatic relationships with the Ottomans. French would often try to intervene and mediate and help the Ottomans negotiate peace treaties with the Austrians or the Russians. Now, the Levant trade was diminishing over the course of the 18th century. One of the problems the Levant Company had, I mentioned that it was a very important exporter of cloth, but the cloth that it exported was very much concentrated in a certain couple of areas in Britain, in Gloucestershire, but especially in Worcestershire. The Levant export trade was probably the most important industry for Worcestershire for a lot of this period. And when those exports began to decline, this became a major political issue in Worcestershire. And a lot of the parliamentary attacks on the Levant Company originated from politicians who were in Worcestershire. So in 1741, because of concerns over the declining Levant trade, the Board of Trade suggested to the Russia Company it might not be a bad idea that they try to establish an overland trade into Persia, which they did with success. It only lasted a few years because the Russians were very offended that members of the Russian Company had helped the Persians to establish a navy. So that was just a brief interlude. 1744, there's a major parliamentary attack on the Levant Company, led by the Worcestershire cloth suppliers. It passed in the Commons, was defeated in the Lords, and the key issue had to do with concerns regarding Jewish admission to the company. There was a fear that if Jews were admitted to the company in Britain, they would deal on an almost exclusive basis with Jews in the Levant. And it was very narrowly defeated. 1753, the membership was opened up, but there were still restrictions on Jewish membership. So if a Jewish member of the Levant Company joined in London, he could not deal with Jewish Jewish merchants in the Levant, and the admission fee was lowered from 50 to 20 pounds. Marine insurance was very important to the Levant Company. It became a major source of diversification for Levant merchants. And this makes sense because of the risks involved in the Levant trade. Levant merchants became experts in marine insurance. And they, in particular, were very heavily involved when the two joint stock marine insurance companies were founded in 1720, the London Assurance and the Royal Exchange Assurance. And you see Levant Company members are very prominent as directors of those two companies. This, you've probably seen this picture before. This is the what was the Khan in Aleppo, where Levant merchants were housed. Quite segregated, I think, from most of the population. In Smyrna, Western merchants lived on Frank Street. Again, segregated, not badly treated, but still apart. I think most of the dealings that the British Levant merchants had on a practical basis were with middlemen, were with Jewish or Armenian middlemen. I think a lot has been written, particularly recently, about how cosmopolitan and tolerant Ottoman society was. And I don't dispute that, but I would say on a commercial level, relations were a little bit different. And I think the same probably applies to India. So here's a couple of things I noticed from my research. The first one I got from the records of the Aleppo factory. So in 1736, the Aga of Skanderun accused John Purnell, the factor marine, of the following. He was keeping women, using foul language, meddling in the affairs of the custom house, cursing the Muslim faith, not paying porters enough, arming 30 or 40 persons of infamous character from the mountains to rob and plunder, killing a Greek, and breaking open the custom house and releasing its prisoners. So very, I think the range of offenses is interesting. It's interesting. The only thing that the Levant Company chose to pursue was that he was engaged in private trade. Furthermore, Purnell's employee Malcoon was described as a most vile and profligate fellow and accused of private dealing in silk. In 1771, James Porter, who had been the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, described drapers in Turkey. Drapers are people who bought cloth from the British. He described them as animals that have nothing in common with the rest of the human species but their form. But, you know, these are commercial relationships. So, Levant versus Russia companies. There were some differences. So, Levant Company, entirely based in London. It's a London company. There's a famous book by Ralph Davis, Aleppo and Devonshire Square. A lot of them lived in the area not far from Liverpool Street Station, Devonshire Square. Russia Company had offices all around England. They had a lot of offices in the north of England. Levant Company membership was declining in the period I'm talking about. Russia Company membership was growing. Levant Company had declining political support, increasing political support for the Russia Company. The Russia Company was very closely tied in with the Bank of England. So there's an inner committee which basically ran the Bank of England. A senior member of the Russia Company was ever present on that committee during the period of my study. Levant Company was a major cloth importer, whereas the Russia Company was the main importer of naval stores. Levant Company had a heavy reliance on Jewish middlemen. The Russia Company had a heavy reliance on naturalized Germans. Levant Company, when they went into financial services, tended to go into insurance. And as I said, the Russia Company had links to the Bank of England. Now, the East India Company, chartered 1600. It was actually chartered a couple of years before the Dutch East India Company, but the Dutch East India Company was far more successful in the 17th century. We know there are three major trading centers, or presidencies as they were called: Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, and all trade with China went through a single port, and that was Canton. Fundamental question: why did the Mughals want to trade with the West? Well, a lot of it has to do with the desire for silver. Mughal economy began to convert to silver-based currency as early as the reign of Akbar. And the Mughals wanted silver from the West. And the key that made the trade viable was that silver mined in the Americas, and that was the source of silver traded by Western merchants, including British merchants, commanded higher prices in the East than the West. The further east you went, the more expensive silver was. The only real significant source of silver in the East was in Japan. British trade goods such as broadcloth were of limited, were very difficult to market in India. And until the middle of the 18th century, about 3/4 of British exports to Asia consisted of silver. This is an analysis I did year 1682 of the cash outflow of the East India Company. About half of the, it's a large number for the time, it's 2.2 million in this year. About half of that goes to repay debt. And the company was largely financed through very short-term bonds of 6 months duration. It intentionally constrained the value of its capital stock so it could pay very, very high dividends. Dividends of 20–25% in this period weren't uncommon. They spent some money on cloth, they spent some money on shipping, but you see this big chunk called treasure. Treasure was far and away the major export, and in this year it amounted to some 660,000. The problem with this was that all the silver was bought from one individual. That individual was one of the top 2 shareholders, and he was also a major bondholder. So there's a real concentration of interest that became a major political issue for the company. Eventually resulted in the establishment of a new East India Company, which then in 1698, which eventually merged with the old East India Company in 1709. So if we look at the East India Company's Asian trade in 1750, the biggest import was textiles. Bengal by then had become the most important province to trade with. Textiles, I'm talking about calicos. And the import of calicos was a threat, of course, for the Levant Company, because to an extent, calicos were a substitute for silk. There was also silk available in the East Indies, both in India and China, but that was had intentionally high tariffs applied to it until late in the century. The Chinese tea trade started to pick up and then really took off in the second half of the century. In the second half of the century, tea was the most important commodity imported by the East India Company. And if you look at the exports, 78% of the exports in 1750 are treasure, just money. So one of the things that often puzzles me, and if any of you have insights into this for Levant merchants, is why would anyone want to get into these trades? They were very dangerous. There was a good chance you would die of disease within the first year or two of going out there. And I think the key part of the answer, at least for the East India Company, was the opportunities for private trade. So this is a diamond called the Regent diamond. And it was bought by one Thomas Pitt. Thomas Pitt was the governor of Madras at the time. He was on the princely salary of £300 a year. He, by the way, was his great-grandson was Pitt the Younger, who led Britain for most of the Napoleonic Wars. He bought this diamond for a little over £20,000, and he sold it for £135,000. So diamonds were one form of private trade, but there was also massive private trade in India, called what they referred to as a country trade. It was trading within India and between India and China. Eventually, opium became a major portion of that private trade, and resulted in the establishment of very successful businesses like Jardine Matheson, which exist to this day. Another important point to note is the military character of European involvement in India. Roughly 3/4 of the European population of the English and French settlements were military personnel. Over 90% of the armies consisted of sepoys, native troops. And the ability to continue to pay military expenses was essential to avoid desertion in time of battle. So the French actually pioneered the use of sepoys under their Governor Dupleix, and it wasn't all kind of one-way traffic. The French did have some victories. In 1746, they captured Madras. Madras was returned a couple of years later in the peace negotiations which ended the War of the Austrian Succession. Then Dupleix was recalled to France. Plassey was the big victory in Bengal, where Clive and his Indian allies defeated the French and their allies and basically knocked the French out as a military power. In 1765, a little bit after my period, there was another major milestone, and this is when the Mughals gave the East India Company the right to collect taxes in Bengal, in what are now the modern Indian states of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. These states had a combined population of 20 million people, far greater than the population of Britain. And this really transformed the East India Company into the government in those areas. The East India Company performed a number of important banking functions: debt management, exporting silver and gold. They set up mints in India. They also tried to establish a bank early on. They had to remit private trade profits back to Britain. And this wasn't all done by the East India Company itself. These agency houses like Jardine Matheson became very prominent in the last quarter of the century. In China, Western merchants could only trade through Canton, and all Western merchants were confined to a very small area in the city. Because of the growth of the tea trade, Canton became the big destination for silver exports. So the period 1760 to 1833, about half of total silver exports from Britain went to Canton. And eventually people thought this became an insoluble problem. And the answer to the problem was, don't export silver, export opium from India to China. And eventually the export of opium entirely negated the need for any silver exports. Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670. So the Hudson's Bay Company operated in a charter area called Rupert's Land. This is named after Prince Rupert of Civil War fame. He was one of the people involved in the establishment of the company. Hudson's Bay Company was not a colonist in this period. It established a small number of trading posts on the shores of Hudson's Bay and on the mouths of rivers, and they encouraged native people to come down those rivers with furs and trade at the forts. There were no more than a couple of hundred employees, Hudson's Bay Company employees here at any one time in the period I was looking at. The French had a different approach. New France actually was a colony with the capital at Quebec, small population, maybe about 70,000 in 1763, but fur trading, fishing were very important parts of the kind of maintenance of the colony. So fur trade was a staple, and the French fur trade was usually 2 to 3 times the size of the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade. Beaver fur was by far the most important fur imported. Beaver fur was the raw material needed to produce a high fashion item in the 18th century, beaver hats. So the outer guard hairs get separated from the felt inside it, and that's used to make beaver hats. Hudson's Bay Company was a model of financial stability. They intentionally controlled the impulse to expand, carefully controlled expenses. They paid dividends every year between 1718 and 1782. They were entirely financed through retained earnings, and between the 1720s and 1760s, their investments more than quadrupled. In effect, the Hudson's Bay Company became a finance company. Famously, it took something like 250 years between 250 years until the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company first visited Hudson's Bay. It was very much a British company. Another interesting feature of the Hudson's Bay Company is that some 80 to 90% of its employees on Hudson's Bay were Scottish. And more specifically, they were Orcadian. So when the Hudson's Bay Company ships left Gravesend, they would go up the east coast of Britain, and they would stop in at Stromness. They would get water, Stromness in the Orkneys. They would get water, and they would take on men to work in Hudson's Bay. The employees were effectively indentured servants. They would sign up for periods of about 5 years, and then they would go back home. East India Company also had a disproportionately heavy representation from Scots, both in the military as well as the administration of the company. Finally, the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company, as I said, supplied slaves to the New World. Bridgetown in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica were the main destinations of slave exports. The total slaves shipped in British and colonial ships between 1662 and 1807 were about 3.4 million. A little under 3 million who embarked actually arrived. About 1 in 7 died in transit in what was called the Middle Passage. So in this period, the British were actually the largest slave traders. A number of other countries were involved in slave trading, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, but the British were the biggest shippers of slaves. It's because the British not only supplied slaves to their own colonies, the Spanish also outsourced most of their slave needs, and the British obtained the right to supply slaves to the Spanish colonies after 1713. So the Royal African Company competed with other Europeans in West Africa, mainly the Dutch and the French. The most serious competition for the Royal African Company were British private slave traders. The plantation owners in the West Indies were very difficult customers. They always wanted more slaves, they wanted cheaper slaves, and they exerted great political pressure to open up the trade to private slave traders. The Royal African Company was always a very tenuous operation financially. They hardly ever made any money. They did maintain some forts in West Africa. This is probably the most famous one, Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. Sorry, I'll be right with you. And like the East India Company, there's a real military character to the Royal African Company. So this is taken from 1729. The Royal African Company forts had 149 officers and soldiers, 22 skilled craftsmen, and 702 people who are euphemistically described as black servants. So the Royal African Company faced the most severe parliamentary challenges of any of the companies. 1698, private traders were permitted to enter the slave trade, but they had to pay some duties to help support the Royal African Company's forts. That was ended in 1712. By 1730, Royal African Company got out of slave trading, and Parliament was explicitly subsidizing the forts used by the private slave traders. By 1750, the company had gone out of business. So if we look at how the companies dealt with overseas populations, what were the relationships between them? I've ordered this in terms of the most restrictive and least interactive to the the most interactive. So in China, the company's dealings with local people were highly restricted. Royal African Company really only had a limited presence around its trading forts. In Hudson's Bay, during this period, the company really didn't go into the Canadian interior. That would only happen in the 1770s. So although the men would go out and hunt, in the immediate proximity of the forts, they really didn't stray that far from them. In the Levant Company factors, I think, dealt mainly with commercial middlemen. In Russia, factors had more latitude to get into different types of business, but there was always the issue of the seemingly capricious actions of the Russian government, which could overnight, end the business. But in India, the involvement with the local population was more extensive. Sizable local populations lived in the areas governed by the company. Madras had a population of some 40,000 at the beginning of our period. This is under the governance of the East India Company. Heavy reliance on local merchants and financiers, and there were strong military relationships. The losers of the political debates, I think the common thread was these were all companies who were struggling financially at the time, but the only one that suffered a catastrophic defeat was the Royal African Company. So in conclusion, I think the chartered companies played an important role in furthering British interests, both within and outside the empire. Companies increasingly began to resemble quasi-banking institutions. And the outcome of the political debates concerning the companies was driven by the economic performance of the companies rather than theories of political economy. And I'll just leave you with this one last slide. I think this is interesting because it shows how the the mottos of the companies evolved over time. So we start the Muscovy Company, 1555. Its motto is "God is our refuge." The Levant Company, 1581, at the bottom left. To God, the state, and friends. The East India Company, 1600. God is our leader. Hudson's Bay Company, 1670. A skin for a skin. Royal African Company, 1672. Commerce flourishes with royal protection and the kingdom with commerce. So there's a lot less reliance on God and much more a hope of profitable commerce and the support of Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Fascinating, and really pleased that you were able to present the Levant Company in the context of all the companies. So I think that gave a great insight.